What happens when privilege meets prejudice in a single devastating moment? When 19-year-old Marcus Johnson sits at an unclaimed desk, he never imagines the chain reaction that will follow. One impulsive slap from entitled heiress Vanessa Whitmore doesn't just sting his cheek, it exposes generations of institutional injustice and unexamined privilege. As the university erupts in protest and powerful donors threaten retaliation, both students face a life-altering question: can a moment of cruelty become a catalyst for genuine transformation? Dear viewer, watch or listen this full story to witness this emotional journey through prejudice, accountability, and the courage to change. And, if you are watching my story for the first time, I humbly request you write the location from where you are watching right now, subscribe this channel and press the bell icon now not to miss the notifications of my daily published news stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. Marcus Johnson stood at the edge of Westfield University's sprawling campus, the weight of his weathered backpack nothing compared to the burden of expectations he carried. The autumn breeze rustled through the ancient oaks lining the cobblestone pathways where generations of America's elite had walked, but rarely someone who looked like him. The scholarship letter that had changed everything still felt like a dream, crumpled and reread so many times its creases had become permanent. "You belong here," his mother Tanya had whispered that morning, straightening his collar with calloused hands that had worked double shifts for years to keep their small apartment. Her eyes, mirrors of his own, held a universe of sacrifice and hope. His worn sneakers felt conspicuous against the polished marble floors of Thornton Hall where Professor Eleanor Bennett's advanced literature seminar would begin in 20 minutes. Marcus arrived early by habit, a lifetime of his mother's wisdom that a black man in America must work twice as hard for half as much. Across campus, Vanessa Whitmore applied another coat of lip gloss in the private bathroom of her premium dormitory suite. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves against her cashmere sweater, the delicate gold bracelet at her wrist, a gift from Daddy for her 18th birthday, catching the light. The Whitmore name adorned buildings across campus, a legacy her father reminded her of whenever her grades slipped below excellence. "You're a Whitmore," she'd heard all her life. "The world is yours by birthright." The dormitory her family had donated bore her mother's maiden name. The scholarship fund her grandfather established admitted precisely the kind of diversity candidates that made for good university brochures while maintaining comfortable demographic ratios. Vanessa had never questioned these arrangements, just as she'd never questioned which seat in every classroom was implicitly hers. Their worlds, running on parallel tracks separated by generations of economic and racial divides, were destined to collide in room 307. Neither could have imagined how that collision would shatter the careful illusions they'd each been raised to believe. As Marcus settled into an empty desk near the window, arranging his meticulously highlighted used textbook and notebook, he felt a flutter of belonging. Professor Bennett's class had been recommended by his community college mentor as the course that had changed her life, opened doors she'd never imagined existed. Vanessa strode through campus, barely noticing the students who instinctively moved from her path. Her phone buzzed with messages from her father, another reminder about the upcoming university donor gala where she would be expected to charm potential contributors as she'd been trained to do since childhood. The familiar, suffocating pressure tightened around her chest. For a flashing moment, she envied her peers whose parents rarely called. The thought vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the practiced certainty that her discomfort was merely the price of exceptional privilege. 2 students. 2 worlds. One classroom where unspoken rules were about to be challenged, where assumed hierarchies would face their first serious threat, and where the careful facades both Marcus and Vanessa had constructed would begin to crumble under the weight of a single, irrevocable moment. The advanced literature classroom in Thornton Hall filled gradually as the clock ticked toward 10 a.m. Marcus sat quietly by the window, sunlight warming the pages of his notebook where he'd already written the date and course title in his precise handwriting. Each new arrival sent a small jolt of anxiety through him, the practiced assessment of who might be an ally, who might be indifferent, who might be hostile. It was an exhausting calculation he'd performed his entire academic life. 2 minutes before class, the room hushed as Vanessa entered with her usual entourage of similarly polished students. Her laugh, practiced to sound effortless, faltered when her gaze swept across the room and landed on Marcus. Specifically, on Marcus sitting in the third row, second seat from the window, the spot she had occupied during every class since the semester began. "Excuse me," she said, voice pitched to carry across the now silent room. "You're in my seat." Marcus looked up, momentarily confused. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize seats were assigned." His voice was soft but steady, years of navigating potential conflicts evident in his careful tone. Vanessa's friends exchanged glances. Someone snickered. "They're not officially assigned," Vanessa replied, her smile tightening. "But everyone knows that's where I sit. Every class. Since September." Each word landed with increasing emphasis. The room had gone completely silent. 20 pairs of eyes watched the scene unfold, most students suddenly fascinated by their phones or notebooks, the universal posture of those hoping to avoid becoming collateral damage in someone else's conflict. "I apologize," Marcus said, gathering his materials. "I'll move." "It's fine," Professor Bennett interrupted from the doorway, her keen eyes assessing the situation instantly. "Vanessa, there are several empty seats. Class is about to begin." Something in Vanessa snapped. Later, she would struggle to explain the surge of indignation that rose through her chest, the absolute certainty that this was a deliberate challenge, that this scholarship student had specifically chosen her seat to make some point, that Professor Bennett was publicly undermining her. "No, it's not fine," Vanessa said, voice rising. "I've sat there all semester. Everyone knows it's my desk." Marcus stood, dignity evident in his straight shoulders despite the flush of embarrassment heating his face. "Really, I'm happy to move. I didn't mean to cause any. You think just because they let you in here on some diversity scholarship, you can just take whatever you want?" Vanessa hissed, words escaping before she could filter them. A collective intake of breath from the class. "Vanessa." Professor Bennett's voice held a warning. Marcus froze, textbook half closed in his hand. Something shifted in his expression, a door closing, a shield rising. "I earned my place here," he said quietly. "Just like everyone else." "Did you, though?" Vanessa stepped closer, months of pressure, insecurity, and entitlement crystallizing into this moment. "Did you really?" Marcus met her gaze directly for the first time. "Yes. I did." The simple certainty in his voice pushed Vanessa past reason. Before she could even process her own movement, her hand connected with Marcus's cheek in a slap that echoed through the stunned classroom. Professor Bennett was between them instantly. "Ms. Whitmore, outside. Now." Marcus stood perfectly still, hand raised halfway to his stinging cheek, the red imprint of Vanessa's fingers already visible against his skin. His eyes remained locked on Vanessa's, not with anger but with something far more devastating, recognition. He saw through her in that moment, through the designer clothes and practiced confidence to the frightened, brittle core beneath. As Professor Bennett escorted a now pale-faced Vanessa from the room, Marcus slowly sank back into the chair. His classmates' gazes burned into him from all sides, their shocked whispers rising like static. Someone's phone camera clicked, a sound that would prove more consequential than anyone could have anticipated. The incident lasted less than 5 minutes. Neither Marcus nor Vanessa realized that those 5 minutes would irreversibly alter the trajectories of their lives, exposing fault lines beneath Westfield University's manicured facade and forcing conversations that had been silenced for generations. By lunchtime, everyone on campus had seen the video. 12 seconds of footage, Vanessa's final words, the slap, Marcus's stunned expression, looped endlessly on screens across Westfield. The clip had been posted anonymously to the university's unofficial social forum, accompanied by the caption, "Whitmore heiress shows her true colors." Marcus sat alone in his dormitory room, phone buzzing with notifications and messages from people who had never spoken to him before. 3 missed calls from his mother. He couldn't bring himself to answer, not yet. How could he explain what happened without causing her worry? The same worry that had creased her forehead when she'd helped him pack for Westfield, her warnings echoing in his mind, "Keep your head down. Work hard. Don't give them any reason." He touched his cheek, the physical sting long gone but the humiliation burning deeper by the hour. The incident replayed in his mind, each iteration adding new details he'd missed in the moment, the horrified expressions of classmates, Professor Bennett's barely contained fury, the brief flash of shock on Vanessa's own face after the slap, as though her hand had acted independently of her will. Professor Bennett had cancelled the remainder of class, asking Marcus to stay behind after Vanessa had been escorted to the dean's office. "This isn't your burden to carry," Bennett had told him, her normally composed features tight with controlled anger. "What happened today, that's on her, not you." Marcus had nodded, unable to articulate the complex emotions churning beneath his carefully maintained calm. It wasn't just the slap or the words. It was the familiar sensation of being reminded that no matter his accomplishments, some would always see him as an intruder, a charity case, a quota to be filled. Across campus, Vanessa sat rigid in an antique chair outside Dean Richardson's office, her phone confiscated by his secretary after her father's third call. The gravity of her situation was slowly penetrating the protective shell of privilege that had insulated her for 18 years. "He provoked me," she'd whispered to her roommate Alyssa before being summoned to administration. "He had to know it was my seat." Alyssa's uncomfortable silence had been the first indication that perhaps, just perhaps, Vanessa had misread the situation entirely. Now, as the minutes ticked by, doubt crept in. The memory of Marcus's expression after the slap, not anger but a profound, resigned understanding, made her stomach twist. She'd seen that look before, she realized with a sickening clarity. On the faces of household staff when her mother made unreasonable demands. On scholarship students during freshman orientation when her friends made jokes about affirmative action. Dean Richardson's door finally opened. "Ms. Whitmore, please come in." The dean's office, with its wood paneling and pictures of illustrious alumni, had always felt like an extension of her family's spaces. Today, it felt like foreign territory. "I've reviewed the incident report from Professor Bennett," Dean Richardson began, removing his glasses. "And I've seen the video." "Video?" Vanessa's voice came out small. "Yes, Ms. Whitmore. The incident was recorded and has been shared widely." His tone was measured but unmistakably severe. "This is a serious violation of our community standards. Physical assault, racial intimidation. It wasn't about race." The words burst from her with desperate force. "It was about my seat." Dean Richardson regarded her with weary eyes that had seen this scene play out too many times before. "Ms. Whitmore, when you questioned Mr. Johnson's right to be at this institution and referenced his scholarship status in derogatory terms immediately before assaulting him, you made it about race." Reality crashed through Vanessa's defenses. Her phone vibrated again in the secretary's desk, undoubtedly her father, who by now would have heard everything. For the first time in her life, the Whitmore name and all its influence felt not like a shield but like a spotlight, illuminating parts of herself she'd never been forced to examine. Meanwhile, a growing crowd gathered in the university commons. Signs were being made, chants practiced. Marcus's phone continued to buzz with messages, now including ones from campus activist groups asking him to speak at an hastily organized protest. He silenced the phone and stared out his window at the campus below, watching as the ripples from that single moment in Thornton Hall 307 spread outward, gaining momentum, transforming from ripples to waves. Dean Richardson massaged his temples as the phone on his desk rang for the fourth time in 20 minutes. He already knew who it was, Robert Whitmore's personal assistant, then his lawyer, then his public relations manager, and now, inevitably, the man himself. With a deep breath that did little to calm his nerves, Richardson picked up the receiver. "Robert, I was expecting your call." The voice on the other end dispensed with pleasantries. "My daughter tells me this has been blown completely out of proportion, Thomas. A minor classroom disagreement that's being sensationalized by social media and campus agitators." Richardson glanced at the closed folder on his desk containing Professor Bennett's detailed incident report, the printout of still frames from the viral video, and the university's code of conduct with relevant sections highlighted. 30 years in academic administration had taught him to document everything, especially when dealing with donors whose names adorned campus buildings. Robert, I've known Vanessa since she was in pigtails, but what happened today wasn't minor. There are multiple witnesses, video evidence. Evidence of what? That my daughter had a momentary lapse of judgment. For God's sake, Thomas, she's 18. Teenagers make mistakes. Whitmore's voice carried the practiced confidence of a man unaccustomed to hearing the word no. A mistake that violated our zero-tolerance policy on physical assault and potentially our non-discrimination policies as well, Richardson countered, steeling himself. The university has procedures that must be followed, regardless of the fact that my family has contributed over $20 million to Westfield in the past decade alone. The question hung between them, its implications unmistakable. Outside the dean's office, the administrative staff moved with unusual caution, hyper-aware of the conversation taking place behind the heavy oak door. Richardson's assistant, Monica, who had served 5 deans over her long career, recognized the particular tension in the air. She'd seen this pattern before, wealthy families leveraging influence to minimize consequences, the university administration weighing financial pragmatism against ethical obligations. Monica thought of Marcus Johnson, whose scholarship application had crossed her desk last spring. The earnest personal essay, the glowing recommendations, the transcript reflecting remarkable achievement despite limited resources. The pride in his mother's voice when Monica had called to confirm his acceptance. Now this. Inside the office, Richardson found himself walking the familiar tightrope. The Whitmore family's contributions to Westfield are deeply appreciated and have helped countless students receive an excellent education, he said carefully. Including students like Marcus Johnson, who is here on merit and deserves the same respect as any other member of our community. Don't lecture me about respect, Thomas, Whitmore's voice hardened. My concern is ensuring my daughter isn't sacrificed on the altar of political correctness. I understand appearances matter, especially in today's climate. A proportional response is appropriate. But expulsion or any mark on her permanent record would be excessive and, frankly, something the Board of Trustees would find troubling. The implicit threat lingered in the air. Robert Whitmore didn't need to mention his close relationships with 3 board members or the upcoming vote on Richardson's contract renewal. I'll be arriving on campus tomorrow morning, Whitmore continued. Have your office set up a meeting with this Johnson boy and his family. We'll handle this privately, with appropriate apologies and perhaps a scholarship enhancement as a gesture of goodwill. Richardson felt a familiar hollowness in his chest, the physical manifestation of compromise that had become too familiar over decades of administration. Marcus Johnson may not want a private resolution, Robert. He has the right to pursue formal disciplinary proceedings. Everyone has their price, Thomas. Just make sure this doesn't become any more public than it already has. As the call ended, Richardson stared at the silent phone, then at the campus outside his window where students were gathering in increasing numbers at the central quad. Signs were visible now, some bearing Marcus's name, others with slogans about privilege and justice. Professor Bennett stood at the edges of the crowd, her presence both observation and subtle endorsement. Richardson had spent his career navigating between institutional preservation and moral leadership, telling himself that incremental progress was better than none at all. But looking at the gathering protest, he wondered whether the tipping point had finally arrived, not just for Westfield University but for his own conscience. Monica knocked and entered with a stack of messages and a concerned expression. Sir, Professor Bennett has requested an urgent meeting about the Johnson-Whitmore incident. And there are reporters from the city paper calling for comment. Richardson nodded, decision crystallizing. Call legal and PR. I want them in my office in 30 minutes. And Monica, he added as she turned to leave, find me everything we have on the university's historical handling of similar incidents. Going back at least 20 years. She paused, something like hope flickering across her features. Everything, sir. Including the sealed settlements. Especially those. Richardson straightened his tie, the weight of institutional memory and personal responsibility settling on his shoulders. It's time we had a complete picture of what we're really dealing with. The protest had grown by nightfall, illuminated by the glow of smartphone flashlights and hastily made signs. Justice for Marcus and privilege is not equal to immunity signs waved in the autumn air. The crowd's energy pulsed between righteous indignation and something more hopeful, the sense that perhaps this incident, unlike others before it, might catalyze real change. Marcus watched from the periphery, hood pulled up, simultaneously drawn to and terrified by the movement forming in his name. He hadn't asked for this spotlight. He'd spent years perfecting the art of academic excellence without drawing attention, navigating predominantly white institutions by being exceptional yet unthreatening. Now, strangers chanted his name while news vans parked at the campus entrance. "You don't have to speak if you're not ready," said Jamal, a senior who led the Black Student Alliance. They'd never exchanged more than passing greetings before today. "But your presence matters. People need to see that you're more than just a viral moment." Marcus swallowed hard, watching as Professor Bennett addressed a group of faculty who had joined the demonstration. Her words carried across the quad, "This isn't an isolated incident. This is a symptom of institutional patterns we've normalized for too long." The vibration of his phone cut through his thoughts, his mother again. This time, he answered. "Marcus, baby, what's going on? I've been calling all day." Tanya Johnson's voice carried the familiar mix of concern and strength that had anchored him throughout his life. "I'm okay, Mama," he said automatically, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "No, you're not." Her response was gentle but firm. "I saw the video. Mrs. Larson from church sent it to me. Why didn't you call me?" The simple question broke something open inside him. "I didn't want you to worry," he managed, voice barely audible above the chants. "I didn't want to be another problem you had to solve." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding, the burden of a child who had grown up watching his single mother work impossible hours, who had learned early to handle his own struggles rather than add to her load. "Listen to me," Tanya said finally, her voice steadying his world as it had always done. "What happened to you is not your burden to carry alone. That girl's actions are not your shame to bear." Around him, the crowd had grown quieter, attentive to someone speaking through a megaphone. Marcus realized with a jolt that they were sharing stories, other students of color recounting similar experiences of dismissal, microaggressions, and institutional gaslighting that had been normalized under Westfield's veneer of diversity and inclusion. "They want me to speak at this protest," he told his mother, throat tight with conflicting emotions. "To tell my story." "And what do you want, Marcus?" The question caught him off guard. So many of his choices had been made within the narrow parameters of what was necessary, strategic, or expected. What did he want? "I want." He began, struggling to articulate the tangle of emotions. "I want that slap to mean something. I don't want it buried under some settlement or forgotten when the next campus scandal happens. I want actual change." His mother's soft hum of approval carried through the phone. "Then you speak your truth, baby. And I'll be there tomorrow to stand beside you." As the call ended, Marcus felt something unfamiliar rising within him, not just anger or hurt, but a clarity of purpose. He moved closer to the center of the gathering, listening as a Vietnamese-American student described how a professor had repeatedly confused her with the only other Asian woman in a class of 80. These were his people, he realized. Not because they shared identical experiences or backgrounds, but because they understood what it meant to be simultaneously hypervisible and invisible, scrutinized yet unseen. Across campus, alone in her premium dormitory suite, Vanessa sat surrounded by opened but untouched textbooks. Her roommates had made themselves scarce, uncomfortable with the notoriety she now carried. Her father's messages had shifted from reassurance to detailed instructions: say nothing publicly. Refer all inquiries to the family attorney. Remember that social media is evidence. The university's preliminary decision had arrived by formal email: immediate provisional suspension pending a full disciplinary hearing. Her father had already called an emergency meeting with the board of trustees, confident that the Whitmore influence would prevail as it always had. Yet something had changed inside Vanessa, some foundational certainty fractured by the events of the day. The look in Marcus's eyes after she'd slapped him haunted her, not fear or even anger, but a weary recognition, as though her action had merely confirmed something he'd always known. For the first time in her carefully curated life, Vanessa felt the ground beneath her shifting. The narrative she'd been raised to believe, that her family's wealth was earned, that her place at Westfield was merited, that her irritation justified her actions, seemed suddenly, devastatingly fragile. Outside her window, she could hear the distant chants from the quad. Against her father's explicit instructions, she opened her laptop and typed her own name into the search bar, watching as hundreds of results populated the screen, her moment of ugliness preserved and dissected from every angle. In that moment, the separate journeys of Marcus and Vanessa converged in unexpected symmetry. Both stood at personal breaking points, facing truths long avoided. Both recognized that whatever happened next would define not just their time at Westfield, but the adults they would become. The morning light cast long shadows across Westfield's administration building as Tanya Johnson climbed the granite steps, her nursing scrubs hidden beneath a carefully pressed blazer borrowed from her supervisor. She'd driven through the night after her shift, fueled by determination that transcended exhaustion. The campus security guard had given her directions to the dean's office with a knowing look. News of the incident had spread far beyond university boundaries. "Mrs. Johnson." A tall woman with silver-streaked locks approached, hand extended. "I'm Eleanor Bennett, Marcus's professor. Professor Bennett. Marcus has mentioned you often in our calls." Tanya accepted the handshake, noting the respect in the older woman's eyes, not pity or condescension, but genuine recognition. "Thank you for supporting my son." "Your son is exceptional, Mrs. Johnson. His voice in my classroom has been invaluable." Bennett glanced toward the dean's office. "They're expecting us, but there's something you should know before we go in." Robert Whitmore arrived an hour ago with his attorney. "They're positioning this as a simple misunderstanding, proposing a private resolution." Tanya's expression remained composed, though her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "There was nothing private about my son being humiliated and assaulted in front of his peers." As they approached the administrative suite, the door to an adjacent conference room opened. Marcus emerged, his face lighting up at the sight of his mother despite the circumstances. Behind him stood Dean Richardson and two other administrators, their expressions carefully neutral. "Mama," Marcus said, voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "You didn't have to come all this way." "Yes, I did." She straightened his collar, a gesture from childhood that conveyed everything words couldn't. "Now, where's this meeting happening?" Before anyone could answer, another voice cut through the hallway, precise, cultured, with the easy authority of unquestioned privilege. "Ah, you must be Marcus's mother." Robert Whitmore approached, hand extended, attorney trailing behind him. "Robert Whitmore. I believe we have much to discuss about this unfortunate situation." Tanya assessed the man before her, the bespoke suit, the practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes, the subtle dismissiveness in his tone that suggested he viewed this as a transaction rather than a matter of justice. "Mr. Whitmore," she replied, accepting his handshake with dignity but not deference. "I'm Tanya Johnson. And yes, we have a great deal to discuss about your daughter's assault on my son." The use of the word assault visibly startled Whitmore, as if hearing the legal term applied to his daughter's actions for the first time. His smile tightened. "Perhaps we could speak privately, without the, audience." He glanced meaningfully at Professor Bennett and the small group of administrators. "I don't think so," Tanya responded, voice level but firm. "Transparency seems particularly important right now." As tension thickened the air, an unexpected interruption came from down the hallway. A young woman with blonde hair pulled into a simple ponytail approached, her expression determined despite her obvious nervousness. "Sorry I'm late," she said, stopping beside Professor Bennett. "Traffic was worse than I expected." "And you are?" Dean Richardson asked, confusion evident. "Alyssa Carpenter. I'm Vanessa's roommate." She clutched a leather portfolio to her chest like armor. "I have information relevant to the disciplinary proceedings." Robert Whitmore's practiced composure slipped momentarily. "Ms. Carpenter, whatever you believe you need to share can be addressed through proper channels. This meeting is private. Actually, Dean Richardson interjected, newfound resolve straightening his posture. Ms. Carpenter contacted my office yesterday with concerns about establishing a pattern of behavior. As such, her testimony is indeed relevant to these proceedings. Inside the conference room, seats were rearranged to accommodate the unexpected additions. Alyssa sat beside Professor Bennett, visibly trembling but determined. Tanya positioned herself between Marcus and Whitmore, a physical embodiment of protection and strength. Before we begin, Whitmore's attorney started, sliding a document across the table. We've prepared a resolution agreement that addresses all parties' concerns. A formal apology from Vanessa, a significant contribution to the scholarship fund of Mr. Johnson's choice, and naturally, a non-disclosure agreement to allow everyone to move forward without further disruption. Tanya didn't touch the document. And what consequences would Vanessa face under this agreement? The attorney smiled blandly. The Whitmore family recognizes the seriousness of the incident and has arranged for Vanessa to undertake sensitivity training. That's not a consequence, Marcus interrupted, surprising even himself with his directness. That's damage control. Alyssa cleared her throat, drawing all eyes to her. I have documentation that might be relevant to this discussion. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened her portfolio. Text messages, social media posts, and recordings of Vanessa making similar comments about other students of color. This wasn't an isolated incident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It's consistent with things she's said and done throughout the semester. The room fell silent as she placed her phone on the table, screen displaying a text conversation from the morning of the incident. Vanessa's words glowed on the screen. Can't believe they let another one into Bennett's seminar. Barely enough seats for qualified students as it is. Robert Whitmore's face darkened as he turned to his daughter's roommate. Ms. Carpenter, loyalty apparently means nothing to your generation. Vanessa welcomed you into her circle, and this is how you repay her friendship. Alyssa met his gaze with unexpected steadiness. Mr. Whitmore, with all due respect, what Vanessa offered wasn't friendship. It was complicity. And I can't be complicit anymore. In that moment, the power dynamics in the room shifted perceptibly. Richardson straightened in his chair, Professor Bennett leaned forward with new interest, and Tanya Johnson's expression softened with recognition of an ally where none was expected. I believe, Dean Richardson said, gathering the documents from the table, that this meeting needs to be reconvened as a formal disciplinary hearing, with all relevant testimony considered. Ms. Carpenter's evidence suggests we're dealing with a pattern that requires institutional response beyond private resolution. Robert Whitmore rose abruptly. Thomas, let's not be hasty. Perhaps we should discuss this privately before. No more private discussions, Robert, Richardson replied, years of deference falling away. That approach is precisely how we've reached this point. As the meeting dispersed with plans to reconvene for formal proceedings, Tanya Johnson found herself walking beside Alyssa in the hallway. That couldn't have been easy, she said quietly. Standing up to them. Alyssa's eyes filled with unexpected tears. It was nothing compared to what your son experienced. Or what other students have endured while people like me stayed silent. Tanya squeezed the young woman's shoulder gently. Silence and speaking up are both choices. Today, you made a different choice. Outside the administration building, the morning sun illuminated a campus transformed. Students gathered in small groups, conversations intense and focused. News crews positioned cameras at the university entrance. Faculty members who had rarely engaged with campus politics wore small blue ribbons, a symbol of solidarity that had emerged overnight. For the first time since the incident, Marcus felt something close to hope, not because justice was guaranteed, but because in the midst of ugliness, unexpected allies had emerged, choosing courage over comfort, truth over convenience. Change, he realized, began not with grand gestures but with individual choices to stand firm in moments that mattered. Vanessa sat alone in the University Counseling Center's waiting room, the institutional beige walls closing in around her. Her father's instructions had been clear: attend this mandated session, say the right things, and help build the narrative of a remorseful young woman who had learned her lesson. The disciplinary committee had postponed their final decision pending these psychological evaluations, a compromise that Robert Whitmore had grudgingly accepted after Alyssa's evidence made a simple dismissal of the incident impossible. 3 days had passed since the video had gone viral. 3 days of avoided gazes in hallways, whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, and increasingly frantic calls from her mother asking if she needed something to help with the stress. The Whitmore solution to uncomfortable emotions had always been to numb them, manage them, or bury them, never to actually feel them. Vanessa, a woman in her 50s with warm brown skin and silver-framed glasses, appeared at the doorway. "I'm Dr. Claudia Waters. Please come in." The counselor's office defied Vanessa's expectations. Instead of clinical sterility, the space felt almost like someone's living room, bookshelves filled with diverse titles, plants thriving on the windowsill, and comfortable chairs arranged to facilitate conversation rather than interrogation. "I understand this session is mandated as part of your disciplinary process," Dr. Waters began, settling into her chair. "How are you feeling about being here?" The question caught Vanessa off guard. She'd prepared defenses against accusations, not inquiries about her feelings. "Fine," she replied automatically, then recognized the inadequacy of the response. "Uncomfortable, I guess. Everyone's judging me based on 12 seconds of video without knowing anything about me." Dr. Waters nodded without immediate judgment. "That must be difficult. Being reduced to a single moment." Something about the simple acknowledgement cracked Vanessa's carefully maintained facade. "They're acting like I'm some monster. Like I've never had a black friend or cared about anyone but myself." Her voice rose slightly. "One mistake and suddenly my entire character is defined." "That resonates with you," Dr. Waters observed. "Being judged by a single action rather than your whole self." "Yes. Exactly." Vanessa leaned forward, relieved to be understood. "I wonder," the counselor continued carefully, "if that experience might offer some insight into what others experience regularly." Vanessa stilled, defensiveness rising. "What do you mean?" "The feeling of being reduced to a stereotype. Of having assumptions made about your character based on limited information." Dr. Waters let the words settle in the space between them. For many students of color at Westfield, that's not a new experience triggered by a viral video. It's daily life. The comparison landed with unexpected force. Vanessa opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again, memory surfacing of Marcus's expression after the slap, that look of resigned recognition rather than surprise. "I didn't think about it that way," she admitted quietly. "Few of us do until we're forced to," Dr. Waters replied. "Vanessa, may I ask you something personal? What do you know about how your family's wealth was accumulated?" The abrupt change of subject caught her off guard. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Possibly nothing. Possibly everything." Dr. Waters' expression remained open, curious rather than accusatory. "The narratives we're raised with shape how we see ourselves and others. I'm curious about your narrative." Vanessa recited the familiar family history, her great-grandfather's real estate developments in the 1920s, her grandfather's expansion into banking, her father's diversification into technology investments. The story she'd heard at countless family gatherings, the legacy she'd been raised to continue. "The Whitmore building on campus was one of my great-grandfather's first major philanthropic contributions," she finished, a note of pride creeping into her voice despite her situation. Dr. Waters nodded thoughtfully. "Have you ever researched which neighborhoods those early real estate developments were in?" No. Why would I? Curiosity, perhaps. Understanding where we come from often illuminates where we are." Dr. Waters leaned back slightly. "Family legacies can be complicated, Vanessa. The narratives we're given and the historical realities don't always align." Something in the counselor's tone sparked an uncomfortable sensation in Vanessa's chest. "Are you suggesting my family's wealth came from something unethical?" "I'm suggesting that privilege rarely exists in isolation from systemic inequities," Dr. Waters replied gently. "And that examining our histories, personal and collective, often reveals connections we weren't taught to see. A memory surfaced in Vanessa's mind, her grandmother's tight expression whenever certain neighborhoods were mentioned, the hushed conversations that stopped when children entered rooms, the family albums with conspicuously missing decades. Small inconsistencies in the polished Whitmore narrative that she'd never thought to question. "Your assignment this week," Dr. Waters said, noting something in her file, "is simply to research. Look into the neighborhoods where your great-grandfather developed properties. Look into Westfield's history with race and admission. Look into yourself." When Vanessa left the counseling center, the campus felt different, or perhaps she was seeing it differently. The buildings bearing donor names, including her own family's, now prompted questions rather than pride. Who had been displaced to build them? Whose opportunities had been limited to preserve others' advantages? That evening, alone in her room while her roommate studied elsewhere, Vanessa opened her laptop and began searching. What she found in old newspaper archives and historical society records unraveled the sanitized family history she'd been raised to believe. The Whitmore fortune hadn't begun with her great-grandfather's visionary real estate investments, but with his company's systematic acquisition of properties in historically black neighborhoods, leveraging discriminatory lending policies and municipal rezoning to force out longtime residents at fractions of market value. The very scholarships that bore the Whitmore name had been established after a 1960s discrimination lawsuit that had been largely scrubbed from university records. Hours later, eyes burning from staring at scanned documents and historical photographs, Vanessa sat back, a strange hollowness expanding in her chest. The family legacy she defended so fiercely was built on foundations she couldn't morally justify. The slap that had seemed like an isolated moment of frustration now appeared as a link in a long chain connecting past to present. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father, "Good news. Dean wavering on suspension. Keep attending counseling sessions and laying low. This will blow over." For the first time in her life, Vanessa questioned whether some things shouldn't simply blow over. Whether accountability might be not just a punishment but a pathway towards something more honest, and perhaps, ultimately, more healing, than the privileged bubble she'd existed within. She closed her laptop and moved to the window, gazing out at the campus where generations of Whitmores had walked before her, each footstep reinforcing pathways of privilege she'd inherited without question. The weight of this knowledge settled on her shoulders, not to crush her, but to awaken her to choices she hadn't known existed. The university chapel stood as neutral ground, its stained glass casting multicolored light across the small circle of chairs where Marcus and Vanessa faced each other for the first time since the incident. Professor Bennett sat beside Marcus, while Dr. Waters accompanied Vanessa. Dean Richardson hovered nearby, his presence both official and uncertain. This restorative justice session had been Marcus's idea, a surprise to everyone involved in the disciplinary process. After a week of deliberation, he had requested this meeting as an alternative to pressing for Vanessa's permanent expulsion. His mother's gentle wisdom had guided his decision: punishment without understanding changes nothing. The silence stretched between them, laden with unspoken words and emotions. Marcus studied his hands, the weight of expectation pressing on his shoulders. Vanessa's usual polished appearance had given way to something more authentic: no makeup, hair pulled back simply, eyes shadowed from nights of disrupted sleep and uncomfortable discoveries. "Thank you both for agreeing to this dialogue," Dr. Waters finally began. "The purpose isn't to rehash what happened, but to address the harm done and explore paths forward. Marcus, since you requested this meeting, would you like to begin?" Marcus lifted his gaze, meeting Vanessa's eyes directly. "I want to understand why," he said simply, his voice steady despite the emotion underneath. "Not just why you slapped me, but why it felt justified to you in that moment." Vanessa's throat tightened. She'd prepared formal apologies, rehearsed remorseful phrases that might salvage her academic future. She hadn't prepared for such a direct question that cut through pretense to the heart of the matter. She began, then faltered, the practiced words dissolving. "The truth is, I didn't think. I reacted from a place of entitlement I didn't even recognize I had." She took a deep breath. "When you didn't immediately move from what I considered my seat, I felt challenged in a way I wasn't used to. And when Professor Bennett didn't automatically take my side. She glanced at the professor, then back to Marcus. I think I'd spent my entire life being accommodated, having space made for me. When that didn't happen, I didn't know how to handle it. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition of her attempt at honesty. That's the immediate why, he said. But there's a deeper one. Why did you immediately question my right to be here? Why did you bring up my scholarship like it was something shameful? The chapel's silence seemed to deepen, the colored light from the stained glass windows illuminating dust motes between them, suspended, waiting. Because that's what I was taught, though never in those exact words, Vanessa admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I was raised to believe the Whitmore name opened doors because we deserved those doors to open. That our position was earned rather than accumulated through generations of advantage. When I saw you in that seat, something in me felt threatened, not by you personally, but by what you represented, someone succeeding without the advantages I'd been told were necessary. Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Do you know what it's like to walk onto this campus every day knowing that some people will never see past the color of your skin to your capabilities? To work twice as hard just to be considered equal. To have every accomplishment questioned or attributed to diversity initiatives rather than merit? Vanessa shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. No. I don't. I can't know that experience. That slap wasn't just a slap, Marcus continued, leaning forward slightly. It was a physical manifestation of something I've felt since the day I arrived here, the message that I don't belong, that my presence is conditional on the comfort and convenience of others. Professor Bennett placed a supportive hand on Marcus's shoulder as he continued, the worst part wasn't even the physical contact or the embarrassment. It was watching how quickly the institution moved to protect you, how Dean Richardson's first call was to your father, how immediately the conversation turned to private settlements and making things go away. It confirmed what I'd suspected all along, that there are different rules depending on who you are. Dean Richardson shifted uncomfortably at the edge of the circle, the truth of Marcus's words impossible to deny after the events of the past week. Vanessa wiped away tears, her defensive impulses giving way to a deeper reckoning. I've spent the past week researching my family's history, she said. The real history, not the sanitized version I was raised with. The neighborhoods my great-grandfather developed were actually thriving black communities that were systematically dismantled. The Whitmore Scholarship Fund was established as the minimum settlement after my grandfather refused to integrate his businesses. My family's wealth, everything that's given me advantages, was built on systems designed to exclude people who look like you. The raw honesty in her voice resonated through the chapel. This wasn't the practiced contrition of someone seeking forgiveness, but the painful awakening of someone confronting uncomfortable truths. I can't change that history, she continued. I can't undo what I did to you. But I can acknowledge it fully, without excuses. And I can commit to being different than those who came before me. Marcus absorbed her words, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. Acknowledgement is just the beginning, though. Real change requires action. I know, Vanessa nodded. I'm just starting to understand what that means. Dr. Waters leaned forward. Perhaps this is a moment to discuss what meaningful action might look like, both personally and institutionally. For the next hour, the conversation evolved from confrontation to collaboration. Marcus articulated the daily micro and macro aggressions faced by students of color at Westfield. Vanessa shared revelations from her research into the university's history of discrimination that had been deliberately obscured. Professor Bennett outlined institutional changes that could address systemic inequities. Dean Richardson, initially silent, gradually joined the discussion, acknowledging administrative decisions that had prioritized donor relationships over student welfare. The university has been complicit, he admitted. Myself included. As afternoon sunlight shifted through the stained glass windows, casting new patterns across their faces, something tentative began to emerge, not friendship or easy resolution, but a fragile framework for moving forward with integrity rather than avoidance. When they finally rose to leave, Vanessa hesitated, then extended her hand to Marcus. Thank you, she said quietly. "For giving me this chance to face you directly. I didn't deserve it." Marcus looked at her outstretched hand for a long moment before accepting it. "This isn't about deserving," he said. "It's about choosing a different path forward than the one that brought us here." Their handshake, brief but genuine, marked not an ending but a beginning, a small moment of human connection that acknowledged both painful truth and possible transformation. Spring sunshine bathed Westfield's campus in golden light as students gathered on the central quad for the inaugural Diversity and Social Justice Symposium. Colorful banners snapped in the breeze, while information tables lined the pathways, staffed by student organizations representing every facet of campus identity. At the center of it all stood a temporary stage where Dean Richardson adjusted the microphone. 6 months had passed since the incident that had forced Westfield to confront its institutional culture. 6 months of difficult conversations, policy revisions, and community rebuilding. The transformation wasn't complete, such work never truly ends, but the progress was tangible in ways few had imagined possible. Marcus moved through the crowd, nodding at familiar faces. His role as co-chair of the newly formed Student Accountability Council had made him a recognized figure on campus, though the visibility still sat uncomfortably on his naturally reserved nature. His mother, visiting for the weekend, walked beside him, pride evident in her bearing. "I still can't believe how much has changed," Tanya said, taking in the scene. "When I drove up here that morning after the incident, I was just hoping for basic justice. I never expected all of this." Marcus smiled, gesturing toward a nearby table where Professor Bennett was distributing information about the expanded scholarship program for first-generation students. Change was overdue. It just needed a catalyst. Across the quad, Vanessa stood with a small group of students, clipboard in hand as they finalized plans for the afternoon panel discussion on the university's hidden history. Her disciplinary consequences had included a semester's suspension, community service hours, and participation in a cultural competency program, but her deeper transformation had come from choices she'd made beyond these requirements. Upon her return to campus, she had approached the Black Student Alliance with research materials she'd compiled on Westfield's historical connections to racial exclusion and exploitation. Rather than centering herself in the narrative, she had offered the information as a resource, stepping back to support rather than lead initiatives addressing these injustices. The path hadn't been smooth. Many students remained skeptical of her motivations, viewing her involvement as performative atonement rather than genuine commitment. Some of her former friends had distanced themselves, uncomfortable with her new perspectives on privilege and accountability. Her father had threatened to withdraw financial support when she proposed redirecting part of the Whitmore Endowment toward reparative scholarships for descendants of communities harmed by her family's business practices. Yet through these challenges, Vanessa had discovered a sense of purpose previously hidden beneath layers of entitlement and conditioning. The painful awakening to her family's true legacy had eventually yielded something unexpected, the freedom to define her own identity beyond the Whitmore name and all it represented. Vanessa. The voice behind her was familiar, though no longer tense with apprehension. She turned to find Marcus and his mother approaching her table. "Marcus. Mrs. Johnson. It's good to see you both." Tanya extended her hand warmly. "The historical exhibit your research contributed to was quite powerful. It couldn't have been easy to uncover some of those truths about your family." "Necessary things rarely are," Vanessa replied, the months of personal growth evident in her straightforward acknowledgement. "But hiding from truth has never made anything better." As Dean Richardson called the gathering to order, the three moved toward the audience area. Marcus and Vanessa weren't friends in the conventional sense. The weight of their first interaction created boundaries that respect for authenticity didn't attempt to erase. But they had discovered something perhaps more valuable than friendship, the ability to work alongside each other toward common goals, their different perspectives strengthening rather than dividing their efforts. The dean's speech acknowledged past institutional failures while outlining concrete changes, revised admission practices, new faculty diversity requirements, mandatory cultural competency training, and the establishment of a community oversight board with actual decision-making power. These changes didn't come from administrative goodwill alone, Richardson noted candidly. They came because students demanded better, because faculty allied with those demands, and because our community finally had the courage to examine the disconnection between our stated values and our actual practices. As the audience applauded, Marcus felt his mother squeeze his hand, her simple gesture conveying everything words couldn't: pride in his growth, recognition of his courage, love that had sustained him through challenges she had hoped he would never face. Nearby, Vanessa sat alone, her own family notably absent from the proceedings. Yet something in her expression suggested not isolation but independence, the quiet strength of someone who had chosen integrity over comfort, growth over conformity. The incident that had brought them to this moment, a slap delivered in entitled anger, could have remained just another example of prejudice addressed through superficial discipline and performative institutional response. Instead, through the courage of individuals who refused easy resolution, it had become a catalyst for authentic transformation. Not an ending, but a beginning. 1 year to the day after the incident in Thornton Hall 307, Marcus Johnson stood at the podium in that same classroom, now designated as the permanent meeting space for Westfield Student Diversity Council. Afternoon light filtered through the windows, illuminating faces both familiar and new. Students, faculty, administrators, and community members gathered to reflect on a year of painful growth and meaningful change. When I walked into this room a year ago, Marcus began, his voice steady with the confidence he'd developed through months of advocacy, I was focused on keeping my head down, doing my work, and getting through my education without drawing attention. I thought survival meant invisibility. He glanced toward Professor Bennett, whose encouraging nod bolstered him as it had countless times throughout the year. What I've learned since then is that real change doesn't come from remaining invisible. It comes from being fully present and visible in spaces where people like me have historically been excluded. It comes from uncomfortable conversations and the courage to speak truth even when that truth disrupts comfortable patterns. The past year had transformed Marcus in ways he hadn't anticipated. The reluctant symbol of campus racism had become a respected voice for institutional accountability. The scholarship student trying to blend in had discovered his power to stand out, to speak up, to lead with both conviction and compassion. The incident that brought us all into this work wasn't unique, he continued. What's been unique is our collective response, the refusal to let it be buried under bureaucracy or forgotten after the initial outrage faded. From her seat near the back of the room, Vanessa listened intently, her expression reflective. The year had transformed her as well, stripping away layers of defensive privilege to reveal a more authentic self capable of facing uncomfortable truths without deflection or denial. Her journey hadn't been without cost. Her father's opposition to her involvement in campus reform efforts had escalated to an ultimatum: withdraw from this social justice obsession or lose financial support. When she had chosen to continue her work documenting Westfield's problematic history and advocating for reparative initiatives, Robert Whitmore had indeed cut her off, forcing her to navigate student loans and part-time work for the first time in her life. Yet in that loss of financial security, Vanessa had discovered an unexpected freedom, the liberation of defining her own values rather than inheriting them unquestioned. The path was harder in practical terms but infinitely more aligned with the person she was becoming rather than the person she had been raised to be. As Marcus concluded his remarks and opened the floor for dialogue, the discussion turned to ongoing challenges and unfinished work. Westfield's transformation remained incomplete. Institutional change always moves more slowly than individual awakening. Some faculty resisted new inclusion requirements as political correctness. Alumni donors threatened to withhold contributions. Students from marginalized communities still reported experiences of alienation and discrimination, though now with greater confidence that their concerns would be addressed rather than dismissed. Real change isn't a destination we reach and then celebrate, Professor Bennett observed during the discussion. It's a continuous process of examination, accountability, and recommitment. Some days we move forward, some days we falter, but what matters is that we keep engaging with the process rather than pretending the work is done. Dean Richardson, who had announced his retirement effective at the end of the academic year, nodded in agreement. The greatest disservice educational institutions have done is teaching simplified narratives that suggest justice is inevitable or that progress occurs without sustained effort and vigilance. As the formal session concluded and people broke into smaller conversations, Tanya Johnson made her way to the front of the room where Marcus was gathering his notes. She'd taken the afternoon off from the hospital where she now worked as a nursing supervisor, having completed her bachelor's degree in nursing through an accelerated program established after her advocacy during the disciplinary hearings had caught the attention of a healthcare foundation. "You spoke beautifully," she told him, straightening his collar in the familiar gesture that had become something of a lucky ritual before his public speaking engagements. "I had a good teacher," he replied, the simple words carrying the weight of lifetime gratitude for her example of dignity and perseverance. Across the room, Vanessa stood somewhat apart, still finding her place in this community that had witnessed her worst moment and her gradual redemption. She had learned to accept the complexity of her position, neither centered nor excluded, neither hero nor villain, but simply human, with the capacity for both harm and healing. As the gathering dispersed, Marcus approached her, their interaction now characterized by the respectful ease of two people who had traveled difficult terrain together. "The research you compiled on the university's discriminatory housing policies in the 1960s made a real difference in the proposal for community scholarships," he acknowledged. The board couldn't deny their own records. Vanessa nodded, accepting the recognition without defensiveness or excessive pride. It felt important to document exactly how the systems worked, not just that they existed. Specificity makes denial harder. "My mother wanted me to invite you to dinner," he added. "Some of the community organizers from downtown will be there. They're interested in expanding the accountability model we developed here to other institutions in the city." The invitation represented something significant, not the erasure of history or the pretense that what had happened could be forgotten, but the recognition that human beings are more than their worst actions or their historical advantages. That transformation, while never guaranteed, remains always possible. As they walked together across the campus that had been the setting for both conflict and resolution, the late afternoon sun cast their shadows side by side on the pathway, different in shape but equal in substance, moving in the same direction despite having arrived from vastly different starting points. The story that had begun with a slap delivered in entitled anger had evolved into something more complex and ultimately more hopeful, a testament not to easy resolution or performative reconciliation, but to the difficult, ongoing work of creating communities where justice isn't merely an abstract ideal but a lived reality reflected in policies, practices, and human relationships. Beyond the incident lay not perfect harmony but authentic engagement, the courage to face history without flinching, to acknowledge harm without deflection, and to commit to creating spaces where dignity isn't a privilege allocated based on power but a right accorded to every human being by virtue of their humanity alone. As Marcus had said in his closing remarks, the work continues. Not because we haven't accomplished anything, but because what we're building requires constant tending. Justice isn't a destination we arrive at once and for all, but a path we choose every day, with every decision, in every interaction. In that ongoing choice lay both the challenge and the promise of transformation, personal, institutional, and societal, that extends beyond any single incident to the larger project of creating a world where such incidents become increasingly unimaginable. Not because we pretend differences don't exist, but because we've learned to navigate them with wisdom, humility, and a shared commitment to one another's dignity. Not an ending, but a beginning. Dear viewer, this story reminds us that true change begins with confronting uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our institutions. Systemic injustice persists not just through deliberate cruelty but through silent complicity and unexamined privilege. Each of us has the power to choose accountability over comfort, growth over defensiveness, and action over apathy. By acknowledging harm without deflection and committing to genuine transformation, we create spaces where dignity belongs to everyone. If this message resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and illuminate the path toward a more just world.